Is this palm native and does it matter? Saving a small ecosystem in the Bahamas. So let me kind of locate the Bahamas for you on this globe as we fly south of Florida and east of Cuba to the tiny island of Eleuthera, which is about 100 miles long and 3 miles wide, and it is a part of the Bahamian island chain. Specifically, we're focusing on the little town of Governor's Harbor, which is kind of, if you see this road over here, this is the main road in the town of Governor's Harbor, and it is the area that we're going to be taking a look at, where some years ago I was able to acquire some land, which is the basis of the Leon Levy Native Plant Preserve. So to tell you a little bit more about my reasons for wanting to start this preserve, I came to this island quite a number of years ago as a guest. I was part of a wedding party, and after the wedding, which was in Nassau, we all flew to this little island, and I fell in love with it and began going back year after year after year. And over the years that I was here, I began to see something happening that was very disturbing. The native plant species were disappearing. Developers were coming in. They were totally destroying the land. They were putting in non-native species. The whole island was beginning to lose its character. There was a change in the culture, because when I first came down, if you had a cold, the housekeeper would say something like, "My grandmother told me to come to the north of the island and get this bush and mix up a tea," and sure enough, it would really work. It would stop your cough, it would stop your stomach ache, whatever happened. And that was being lost. And the women on the island who used to do the thatching and the plating, that was all going. And so I decided that I could save the island, if not the world, by creating this little piece of native preserve. And it's something that's never really been done in the Bahamas. It's really something that doesn't exist, where there's a piece of land that attempts to create the native habitat, that attempts to have what was there, that attempts to be able to educate the tourists, the school children, the residents about the heritage that they have. So I found that in my wanting to do this, it was a bit of a learning process for me, because I felt, what was it I was trying to do? And I realized I wanted to do everything: conservation, preservation, reintroduction of species, documenting of the native plants, education. I had huge ambitions once I got started on this. And what happened was, I had this vision, and part of it was that I went to Nassau and I visited the local Bahamas National Trust facility, which was called the Retreat. And I walked through these kind of beautiful paths and things, and I said, that's what I want my preserve to look like. So I went to the Bahamas National Trust and I said, would they want to work with me to develop this on the island of Eleuthera? Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Bahamas, there are probably about 100 out islands, and some of them are well known, like Grand Bahamas, Nassau, or New Providence, Abaco. Eleuthera is one of the lesser known islands, and it's dying for tourism. So they were thrilled that I came along and said, would they like to work on this with me? And they said, absolutely. So this began a wonderful partnership with the local government authorities. To my right is Earl DeVoe. He's the Minister of the Environment, and I've got to know him quite well. And on the other slide, you can see some of the other local officials. At the end is the most important man in terms of my work with Bahamas National Trust, because he is Eric Carey. And I was very lucky. He's the head of the Bahamas National Trust. He lives in Nassau, but he's a native of Eleuthera. So he was thrilled to have a project on his island, and it gave him an opportunity to come back and forth all the time. So he was especially delighted to put a lot of resources into this. And without this, we could not, I couldn't have even begun to think about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Eleuthera from the geological, the cultural, the natural resources, and see if I can kind of talk a little bit about this. Our story really begins a long time ago, basically geologically 200 million years, as the Bahamian Islands begin to emerge. And I'm not going to attempt to tell you a lot about the geology, because you would know in a second that I really don't know what I'm talking about. But let's say it became an island. Somehow the seas changed, the glaciers changed, and we ended up with this long, narrow strip of land that I showed you before, with a very gently undulating topography that goes from about sea level to about 100 feet, maybe a little more. But the real story of what we're talking about begins in about 500 CE, when we begin to get migration from some of the other areas. And basically the migration begins coming up from South America, and we have the introduction at that point of the Lucayan and the Arawak, or the Lucayan Indians, who are the Arawak. The Lucayans are rather gentle, and they were coming to the island. They were fleeing from the Caribs, who apparently were cannibals, basically, and they were running after and capturing the Lucayans. So the Lucayans began to migrate. And in 1492, you know what happens. The Spanish come. They begin to develop the island. They begin bringing some of their culture. And then in 1648, we have another invasion, so to speak, and that's the British. Led by Captain William Sale. They come from Bermuda to settle on this beautiful piece of land, which they call Eleuthera, which means freedom. And those first British to come in 1648 had a terrible time. Everything that could have possibly gone wrong did. The boats capsized, they had no food, it was a very harsh winter, but help was on the way from the most unlikely of places. Governor John Winthrop of Massachusetts heard about this, and this was a Puritan colony up in Massachusetts, and they were very worried about these brethren who were starving and having such a hard time. So they went around to all the local churches, and they raised 600 pounds, and they sent it to Eleuthera. Well, this saved everybody. The Eleutherans were so thrilled, and they didn't want to feel, and this, I love this, they didn't want to feel the sin of ingratitude. So they chopped down a lot of wood, the Brazilado wood, which was very hard wood. They sent it, of all places, to Harvard College, which was this fledgling university. And they said that they should sell it and use the money to help Harvard. So Harvard did just what it was supposed to. They raised 124 pounds. And from the sale of this wood, they were able to purchase the land to expand the campus, which at that time had only one building. So here's the Eleuthera Harvard connection that very few people know about, but in fact was the subject of an article in the Harvard Gazette last June. So, I mean, I knew the story. It's always been the local lore about how Eleuthera saved Harvard. But anyway, by then, as we move along, what happens is the pineapple is introduced into Eleuthera, and this becomes an extremely lucrative crop. So we have the English coming, we have they're bringing in slaves, they're exporting these pineapple, and it is a wild thing because in the 17th century, the Eleuthera pineapple is like caviar. People can't get enough of it, so they're exporting it. Things are really very prosperous, and everybody is very happy because, just to give you an idea, 92 dozen pineapples were shipped to England in 1880. They were the leading exporter of pineapples. They were sending 700,000 dozen. I mean, the numbers are extraordinary. And the pineapple is very sweet. It's got a white flesh. It's really, really a wonderful, wonderful, tasty thing. But what happened next was rather sad because, well, shall we say, things hit the doldrums. Dole began to produce pineapple in Hawaii. It killed the pineapple trade in the Bahamas. By the 1900s, we have a real collapse of it. And then other things were happening too. There was a McKinley Tariff Act, and it cut off the export to America of the Eleutheran pineapple and gave an advantage to the Hawaiian pineapple. So there we are. It was a real, real problem. And the island began to decline. But it had a lot of wonderful natural resources. It had fish, it had flora, it had birds, and there were many other resources that had been cultivated over the years. So let's go back a little and talk about some of the things that were there. Before Columbus comes, we had wonderful forests, and they had the mastic, the mahogany, the cedar, and the brasiletto that I told you about, which I couldn't find a really good picture of, so I didn't leave it. They also had wonderful edible plants. Here's just a kind of local names of some of the strange and exotic fruits that they had: the granny bush, the strongback, the darling plum. But not everything was wonderful. They also had a lot of poisonous species, and I guess by trial and error they figured out which ones they were, because they all look rather seductive, shall we say, and you can't tell that they're going to kill you. But anyway, so they had a lot of the native foods, but also each of the migrating cultures brought their own food. They had the European heritage, we had the African heritage. They were all bringing their own, the pigeon pea, the okra, all these wonderful, wonderful things that were traced back. And it's kind of interesting, the pigeon pea comes to the Bahamas by way of the American colonies, because the slaves who came to America and then to the Bahamas brought their local foods with them. They also discovered that many, many of the plants that they had fantastic medicinal uses. So remember, I said one of the things when I first came was that we had a lot of these available, and then they were beginning to disappear. But they had discovered that the uses of leaves to brew teas made wonderful, wonderful remedies. And so I'll just show you a few of them. They're kind of wonderful to see. This is the lignum vitae, which is a tea to treat the cough. It helps arthritis, and you can use the wood for construction. So it's a pretty special plant. Then there was the cascarilla. It's like a cinnamon bark, and it's used to make a tonic for digestive irritations. And the bark gives you a black dye. Then there's the wonderful gumbo limbo. And the gumbo limbo makes a tea for anti-inflammatory, for gout. It's also a great source of food for migratory birds. It's a wonderful wood for building, and it's quick growing. And then one of the most interesting plants was the five-finger plant. That one is used for just about every treatment you can imagine. It's also apparently an aphrodisiac. You name it, it does it. And we thought this was such an important plant that when we were looking for a logo for the preserve, we chose it, and we had a little rendering of it put up to make into the Native Plant Preserves logo. So here we were. Now the thing that I had to do was find a site. And as I said, I did finally find one. And one of the reasons that the site I chose to acquire was so important was, first of all, it had mostly undisturbed areas, or so we thought. It had fresh water, it had a lot of native plants, it had gorgeous wild orchids, it had a lot of coppice, and it had a wonderful elevation. So this seemed like the ideal site. Here are some of the things that we found. They had beautiful red mangroves. We had dry broadleaf evergreens. We had other kinds of forests. We also had, and this was kind of, just click through some of these so you can see them. We also had an existing water feature which turned out to be very, very wonderful. And going back to the geology, originally the sea would have been in this location. As it receded, you can see there was the groundwater, and then a freshwater lens formed over this. And that is as much as I'm going to talk about in terms of geology. But it left us with a really lovely, lovely water feature. And as I said, we had some beautiful native orchids. However, we discovered there were some problems. It wasn't all what we had thought, because as you can see from this slide, we had an abandoned quarry which had been just pillaged. You know, they just pillaged the land. There was an old cistern. There were a lot of disturbed areas. It was a little bit less wonderful as we began getting closer to the actual beginnings of what we were going to do. And mainly what we discovered, there had been a lot of invasive species. There was the Australian pine, which had come in, which looks very beautiful, but it's really a bad plant because it drops needles, it prevents other plants from growing. It's not stable in hurricanes because it's got shallow roots. And it was originally brought in to replace native species. And it was not a very good idea. And you know, we've run through some of the reasons that these things are undesirable. But really, it kills the native habitat. And that's the main reason you don't want to have invasive species. So we began a removal of them, which was quite extensive. And once we did that, we had to begin reevaluating what we had left and to kind of assess the disturbed areas and see what we could do. So this necessitated many meetings, and here you can see again Eric Carey from the Bahamas National Trust, and the second from the left is our botanist Ethan Freed, who is a genius in terms of knowing the Bahamian plants. There is nothing he doesn't know. And the man with the white cap next to the guy in the green shirt is, believe it or not, the lawyer for the Bahamas National Trust. And since we have a lot of Greeks here, you'll all be happy to hear, he is a Greek named Pericles Malice, and his family came to the Bahamas in the 1890s from Rhodos because they were sponge divers. The sponge diving was collapsing. And so we ended up with a Greek lawyer in the Bahamas who knows more about the botany than almost anyone who's native to the area. So you see, it is
on an island that has a Greek name.
Yes, on the island with a Greek name, thank you. And so you see, you never know. So then we began working with a wonderful landscape designer named Raymond Jungles, and we began getting all of these lovely ideas of how it would look with paths and restorations and mangrove swamps and ridges. And I was really most interested in the fact that we had a nice elevation and we were going to have a hilltop gazebo to overlook the whole area, which I thought, wow, that sounds like fun. And we began, you know, it's really a lot of work to kind of figure out what you're going to plant, where you're going to put things. We began to think who was going to come, who was our audience, and we really wanted to make this something that would be very special to the school children, who were, I think, the most important constituents we would ever have, because they had no way of learning this kind of history if there wasn't a place like this. And so the education ministry, everybody was really very excited about it as we began talking. And we hope that in the end, every school child on the island of Nassau, and from the outer islands will eventually be able to have, during their school education, at least one trip to the preserve to learn about their heritage. Because while our initial idea was to use the plants local only to the island of Eleuthera, over the years we want to add the plants that are indigenous to the rest of the Bahamas as well. So we began to lay out the trails and the demonstration areas, and on the, well, you can see it gets more and more complicated because every time I look at something I have another idea of improving it or whatever. But this is the first phase that we're going through, and I was very happy that last February we began construction of the buildings that will eventually be part of the preserve and will help us to implement this grand plan. So you can see we're working on the water feature, we're building trails, we're building buildings, we're clearing, we're doing whatever you do. And it's amazing though, because things grow so quickly in the Bahamas that we began bringing in some of the species that had been lost. So here was this area, but here are some of the species that we are reintroducing. We're also, as we do that, what happens is the local biodiversity begins to come back. So you can see we have a little Bahamian boa constrictor that we found on the property. And the holy grail is that we will create the habitat that will bring back the wonderful Kirtland's warbler, which has been seen in the Bahamas and is a wonderful bird that spends its summers in Michigan and winters in the Bahamas. And it seems to like new growth. So we hope that by revegetating the area, it will attract this wonderful Kirtland warbler. And that's a big thing. And we also hope that as the species come back, it will also bring back some of the birds. These are also some of the birds that we have already found as we began clearing. Some of these birds began coming back within a very short time. So you can see how exciting this is going to be, not just for the flora, but we're going to have the wonderful birds that are available. And we're going to have all these, we realized that what we could also do was use some of these invasive species. So we began thinking we would have paths and trails, and we'll have several miles of trails that will go around the whole property. And the base on the trails is the chipped casuarina trees, those terrible invasive pines that I told you about. We found a use for them. We have a giant chipper, and it chips and chips and chips, and it makes the base for our trails. So that was a really wonderful, wonderful discovery. And we were also able to find some wonderful people to work with. As I said, that was Raymond Jungles. He's a well-known landscape architect and designer who worked with the great Adolph Burley Marx. And he sent me a note the other day to tell me it was, I think, his 100th birthday, Adolph Burley Marx's, had he still been alive. And next to him is our botanist, Ethan Freed. And Camilla Adair is a young lady who lives in the Bahamas, in Governor's Harbor, and she is our site manager, overseeing all of this wonderful stuff. So last spring, we decided it was time to sort of bring over some of the local officials, and there's Ethan, and he's giving a tour of the preserve to the local officials. This is a bench made by one of our workers, and here he is showing the Minister of the Environment what we're doing. And as you can see, there are a lot of the local officials coming through to see what we were doing. So this is kind of where we are at this point. And now I'm going to go back to my original question. What's a native species, and does it matter? We started by thinking that we should only have the things that were there before Columbus arrived. But in some cases, you couldn't always be sure whether it had come before Columbus or after Columbus. Take the Cocos nucifera. which is the, which we just saw. Let me bring that back. Yeah. This is the local coconut palm. Well, people know that it came from the South Pacific, but was it there before Columbus? Was it there after? Probably it came after, but it's technically not, so it's technically not native. But when we were working, we found this amazing grove of these palms. And would you have taken them out, even if they weren't native? Happily, we didn't. So that's a little history of the evolution of a native plant preserve in the Bahamas.